emancipatory, practical and normative, the need to be political, the need to think about what an emancipatory politics might be. And I've introduced the concept of communicative justice as part of this framing. And then we've introduced a character you all know very well, Elon Musk. So to begin, again with this slide, Musk donated an estimated $132 million to the Trump campaign and other Republicans in the run-up to this year's US election. He also served as a policy advisor and promoter to the Trump campaign, effectively turning his social media platform, X, into a mouthpiece for the Make America Great Again campaign. He's now been appointed to lead what's been called a Department of Government Efficiency that will sit outside of government and therefore outside of mechanisms of accountability, but have huge power to, in Trump's words, this is a quote from Trump, drive large-scale structural reform and create an entrepreneurial approach to government never seen before, to dismantle government bureaucracy, slash excess regulations, cut wasteful expenditures, and restructure federal agencies. The very blueprint of neoliberalism, privatization, deregulation, a campaign to depublic everything. There's now an established pattern of Musk attacking non-profit groups, journalists, and any others who produce information that he disagrees with or he thinks may not be helpful to his goals or image. A pattern, of course, that runs very counter to vows by him that he's a defender of the First Amendment guarantee of free speech, a cornerstone of this thing we call liberal democracy. Musk is the richest man in the world, worth some $290 billion, and has an awful lot to gain from a Trump presidency. Many of the companies he owns, including Tesla, SpaceX, and Starlink, rely heavily on government subsidies. He's already started to benefit by way of the stock market, with his investments soaring more than $26 billion on November the 6th, the day of the election. With a friendly anti-regulation government, Musk will likely continue to amass enormous wealth and consolidate power while using his feed on X as a megaphone to boost his allies. Since Musk endorsed Trump in July, he's increasingly amplified pro-Trump posts and conservative politicians. Yet on election night, one of Musk's posts to his millions of followers read, "You are the media now," insinuating that his platform has enhanced democratic participation. Of course, in these circumstances, our field, the fields of media and communications, have never been more relevant as a discipline, just as the practices and the institutions that it interrogates have never been more central to social and political life. The consequences and influence of Musk are clear for the world to see. The what of Musk is indisputable, yet very few attempt those broader questions of why we are in this particular conjuncture. If we can't explain why we are where we are, then we can't understand or contribute to social change. Alongside the election in the US, it would be remiss to ignore the glaring epicenter of the prevailing global order's efforts to reproduce itself, the state of Israel's ongoing campaign of genocide against Palestinians in Gaza and its gradual expansion into the West Bank. And here I'm taking from the work of an editorial collective from the journal Communication, Culture and Critique, of which I'm a part. As of November 2024, the Israeli military invasion and occupation of Gaza has displaced millions, resulting in at least 43,000 Palestinian deaths. Tens of thousands more have been killed by starvation, neglect, and lack of access to adequate healthcare. And despite repeated votes in support of ceasefire by the vast majority of nations in the United Nations, the state of Israel's collective punishment of the people of Gaza for the horrendous attacks against Israeli citizens on October the 7th, 2023, has only intensified, thanks to the unmitigated political support of the United States and many of its Western European allies, who've provided crucial funding, weapons, and diplomatic support. These powers strongly deny the charge of plausible genocide in Gaza, formally recognized by the International Court of Justice, while many Western legacy media outlets have actively censored the genocide in Gaza. Yet despite unprecedented journalistic censorship, most of the world has borne witness to genocide's grim hallmarks in Gaza: the mass displacement and killing of civilians, the wanton destruction of civilian and cultural infrastructures, including mosques, churches, and hospitals, thanks to the heroic documentation efforts of journalists and Palestinians, often equipped with little more than smartphones and fleeting social media accounts. So we get something here of powerlessness being addressed. Far from its disputed claims as the only democracy in the Middle East, the Israeli military has engaged in the targeted killings of journalists and media workers in Palestine and Lebanon. It's raided and shuttered newsrooms in the West Bank. The Israeli state has also censored and threatened Israeli journalists, as well as academics, activists, filmmakers, and other artists who've expressed solidarity with Palestinians or criticism of the Israeli military's ruthless campaign against civilians in Gaza. Israel is hailed as a startup nation, honing techniques of surveillance, targeting, spatial control, and warfare. An AI called Lavender rapidly processes massive data to generate kill lists, also calculating the collateral murder justified by the desirability of the targeted person. And if you want to hear more about this, you should go to Barak Tournament's talk in this conference. Another, which the military calls the gospel, generates lists of buildings or other structural targets to be attacked. These so-called innovations in war and policing are rapidly exporting around the world in the service of targeting racially subjugated populations and imposing border controls. As critical scholars of media, communication, culture, and technology, we have to reject the notion that our fields of study are disconnected or separable from the violent colonial conditions on the ground in Gaza. Now, I know that in Turkey, this is well understood, but it is not the case in the US or much of the rest of Europe. Hegemonic notions of scholarly impartiality, journalistic objectivity, technological neutrality, and technologically driven disinformation have all been enlisted by the State of Israel and its allies to erase the Palestinian people, to distort collective understanding of their lived realities and struggles, and to discredit anyone willing to affirm their humanity, despite the so-called democratic potential of digitalization. War is digital political communications, The digital mediation of high-tech genocide in Gaza should be front and center of critical approaches in our field, and we need scholars in Turkey to lead the way. Anti-colonial and feminist critics of excessive violence in the name of empire have long challenged that warped humanism of nominally impartial professional journalism based on seemingly neutral facts and legitimate visual evidence. Yet our so-called free media continue to dutifully occlude and obscure mass violence, enabling and reproducing our neoliberal democracies by rendering some lives breathable and others not quite human enough, and therefore dispensable. Of course, this is by no means unique to the context of Israeli settler colonialism. Media outlets around the globe spanning liberal and authoritarian divides, including those committed to professional notions of objectivity, like the New York Times or the BBC, mimic such biased politics of representation. For much of the 21st century, internationally oriented commercial media outlets have gamely participated in the cultivation of a war on terror discourse, mobilizing Islamophobia to justify violence against Afghans, Iraqis, Syrians, Somalis, Pakistanis, and Yemenis. Those same outlets have, by and large, normalized the mass civilian and slaughter of racially marked Palestinians. Israeli cyber intelligence companies like Pegasus and global technology giants like Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft have made themselves central infrastructural actors of the genocide, both through technology provision and media censorship. The Israeli state has killed at least 137 journalists and media workers, the vast majority of them Palestinian. Many prominent writers, artists, journalists of conscience have resigned in protest against their employers' coverage of Gaza, including at the BBC. Just as dozens of workers at Microsoft and Google have been fired for protesting their employers' essential support in the digital logistics of war, including artificial intelligence targeting. Within the tech industry, this repression exposes how ideals of corporate innovation for so-called democratic gain have given way to colonial military contracts as part of profit expansion. Technology is always innovated for power, including military power and wealth over democratic gain. The distorted legacy media coverage of the high-tech genocide in Gaza pushes us to challenge foundational normative theories, whether of media and democracy or technological innovation and freedom in and well beyond Palestine. When we look around and seek to explain these crises, it's easy to see that liberal democracy is a delusion. It is neither democratic nor liberal. Power and wealth collude and capture our digitalized worlds for anti-democratic ends within a context of global capitalism. And I want to talk briefly about that. Multiple analyses show us that capitalism is the socio-historical driver of social injustices, of climate catastrophe, of financialization, of de-democratization. Our capitalist systems of media and communications not only sustain a capitalist economy, but also nourish a capitalist society and hegemony, enabling big tech to evade paying appropriate taxes and avoid antitrust reform for corporate gain. Yet still our analyses remain stuck in the mode of trying to promulgate good behavior of these tech giants who devour us through legal reforms that will at best leave us with a form of benevolent tech dictatorship. Or worse, They enable a form of order and confidence to develop around systems of sustained accumulation of wealth that bend and adapt to ensure their pursuit of capital remains relatively unhindered. Coming back to the need for critical approaches to be emancipatory, questions of social change, which emancipation demand, invariably center their attention on the technology alone. They encourage us to think how technology-enabled processes and practices enhance or restrain citizen participation and civic agency, how technical affordances of particular platforms lend themselves to citizen engagement or not, how algorithms govern and automate decision-making to the detriment of democratic principles, all the while somehow being oblivious to the anti-democratic worlds they are part of and sustain. This assumes then that the solutions are also digital, and this mostly translates into more and better regulation, tweaking and taming of the giants, rather than reimagining what a transformative digital world for a just democracy might be. An approach based on legislative reform that wishes to tweak and tame these global media and tech industries simply finds itself in an endless process of squashing down one problem as another pops up somewhere else, because the underlying issues and systemic causes remain unaddressed. Tinkering with media and tech policy will not solve the democratic crisis they are so deeply implicated in. The real problem is that our media and tech worlds are used within a capitalist system entangled with the geopolitics of nation states, which uses these technologies not for the emancipation of the people, but for the sole benefit of making the capitalists even richer than they already are and sustaining power of neoliberal hegemonies. Capitalism has both an economics and a politics, and is part of capitalist societies. Social change requires changing the entire socio-economic system, as well as the media and technology industries, since their entanglement with capital is so intrinsic to their form and practice. Raymond Williams once said that to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. I think we're all very good at despair. We can all wallow in the problems that we are facing in our digitalized worlds. But where is our vision of a better world? How can a critical approach be emancipatory in the face of global capitalism? Morozov has written, the radical critique of technology can only be as strong as the political vision to which it's attached. No vision, no critique. Yet our field has failed to provide a critique, an emancipatory critique, at a moment when media and communications are so crucial to the world's social order. So where do we go for a hopeful, emancipatory political vision? In his article, Hope in Common, David Graeber assures us that hopelessness is not natural. It needs to be produced. That rulers make it their mission that alternatives and social movements are not perceived to be flourishing. That despair renders change a fantasy. In other words, hopelessness is an ideologically induced condition. Our dominant media and tech systems peddle ideologies of the hopelessness of change in their endeavors to cling to capitalist forms of reproduction. This is the way of the world, they tell us. And it reminds me of a Mark Fisher quote, that says it's easier now to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, what he calls capitalist realism. And so we're left with nothing but tech solutionism. But tech solutionism doesn't solve problems. It simply monetizes them in a different way. We're avoiding solutions to our problems because the sort of structural solutions that are not favorable to capital never come into existence. Hence, we must avoid the democratic delusions of digitalization that do no more than tweak regulation to leave us at best with benevolent tech dictators. Hope lies elsewhere. Hope lies in the attempt to deliberately replace what capitalism seeks to preserve, private property and wealth accumulation, with public use and public good based on co-obligation, co-decision-making, and co-governance. Given our neoliberal democratic hegemony, to make hope possible, to be critical, we need to consider what a counter-hegemonic approach to democratic media and communication systems that work for a reconceived, transformative, and just democracy might be. We need to foreground struggles and practices that seek to transform economic power structures and address this thing called democracy by way of the social and political practices of justice. A call to combat oppression, exploitation, expropriation, and discrimination, such that those who are subjected to systems of domination are able to participate as equals in co-determining the digital, institutionalized social order to which they belong. For as Forst states, the demand for democracy is a demand for justice. In my book, I talk about the need to advance a concept of the media commons in this regard. A media commons speaks to the sharing of resources and services stewarded for the common good rather than private gain, in a manner that is necessarily different from commercial media and tech, and offers an alternative value system to capitalism. A commons doesn't common alone. It sees publicness as a site of resistance and collective struggle, and a place of democratic imaginaries. Media commons is for communicative justice. A media commons is a wholly different way of conceiving of our media and communication systems, and it is a conception I'm trying to reimagine here. One that would promote an array of alternative media and tech ownership models at different levels, from the hyperlocal to the international. A media commons would be engaged in media and communicative justice that requires the understanding, exposing, and challenging of historical and systemic media and tech injustices that ideologically, institutionally, and operationally reproduce the harms of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and settler colonialism. Rather, media commoning sees publicness and its creation as a process that can enhance collective lives amongst heterogeneous publics. The media commons would be based on a counter-hegemonic conceptualization of power as democratic and relational, a means of cultivating freedom, the power of everyone to realize their capacity to participate in the shaping of social and political life. A counter-hegemonic approach to power directs its attention to the way each person's capacities are limited or constrained, and whose interests are being served by the exercise of power in different situations. One example that I'm drawing, and I'm not talking to these slides explicitly because they're just conditions that I want you to reflect on while I'm talking, but one example that is an easy example to think of is journalism. In the media commons, Journalism would not be only about holding power to account, as we commonly refer to, but also about addressing powerlessness. If we reoriented our practices of journalism to addressing powerlessness, there would be a dramatic shift in what our systems of news and practices of journalism would be. Because democracy can't work for some people and not for others. Power and democracy are not mutually exclusive, but interdependent on one another. In other words, democracy is never independent of power, and media as instruments of democracy are never independent of power either. How this interdependence is manifest and managed will have consequences for how powerless people are in our mediated worlds. It is the understanding of this interdependency of media and democracy, media power and democracy, that we are able to reimagine what a democratic media might become. We are constantly told that a free media are at the heart of democratic life, but a democratic media operating for communicative freedoms is so much more than this. In the democratic way of life, institutions and structures, including those of our media and communication systems, are brought about by subjects of the democratic process. They are the ones who correct and adjust the design and outcome by means of public deliberation. Citizens assembled in the space of democratic media enable free cooperation in all major social spheres to overcome exclusion by constantly pointing out that the realization of freedom, equality, and solidarity is not possible under the prevailing social and economic conditions. This forces a shift away from a focus on individual rights and institutional media freedoms and encourages us to think of communicative freedom among equals as central to these progressive visions of democratic media and communication systems that work for democracy. And this will, of course, also mean creating the conditions for a fairer, more equal society to exist, for communicative justice to ensue. A democratic egalitarian understanding of social and communicative justice is one where all people have equal access to the material and social means to live flourishing lives and be equally empowered to contribute to the collective control of the conditions and decisions which affect the common good. An approach that explains our digital lives and worlds through an understanding of media and tech power and their relationships to other forms of geopolitical power, of states and of capital, and then seeks to imagine alternative, emancipatory futures. This is what a critical approach to digitalization entails. So, as friends, colleagues, scholars, let's get to it. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Fenton, for your insightful and